Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post. Colleges are finally canceling ridiculous affinity graduations. If people want to get together and celebrate their specific race or sexual preference while they graduate, they need to finance it on their own. And this is a response to the crackdown from the new administration. The Department of Education has been warning colleges and universities to cut it out with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this is one thing that has broken through even at Harvard. From the Harvard Crimson, last year, Harvard hosted 10 affinity celebrations for the class of 2024. 10 separate ceremonies financed by Harvard. They had Arab, they had Black, they had Indigenous, Latinx, which even people of Latin origin do not like. They had first generation, low income, Asian American Pacific Islander, and DESE graduates. From inside higher ed, amid DEI crackdown, students hold their own affinity graduations. Which, okay, that's fine as long as you want to do it privately and you don't expect the institution, which accepts federal funds, to put on these discriminatory events. Although why Harvard needed 10 separate graduation events is a little bit of a mystery. Imagine if the DESE or the Arab people or the Indigenous people didn't have their own ceremonies. Colleges have scrapped affinity graduation celebrations as Trump targets DEI, and state bans also take effect, but new traditions may be starting. The new traditions of pay for it yourself privately if you really think you need to have a special party for yourself based on your skin color or your sexual preference or national origin. As soon as the fraternity brothers of Epsilon Chi, the University of Kentucky chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha, the nation's oldest historically black fraternity, heard that the university was canceling its annual celebration of black graduates, they jumped into action. Pierre Petitfrere, Epsilon Chi's former president and himself a class of 2025 graduate, says another board member, Christopher Washington, initially had the idea of launching a replacement event and holding it off campus. It's not that hard to figure out. When the government says we're not going to sponsor this free thing for you anymore, it's inappropriate. To come up with the genius idea of having your own private event is pretty much not that big of a leap. The brothers of Epsilon Chi had ample experience hosting events and had a strong relationship with the nearby Lyric Theater and Cultural Center, which offered to host the event for free. Well, now you're getting somewhere. If they want to do a donation to your event, you're way ahead. From there, Petitfrere said, donations for things like decor, cords, and stools began rolling in. Ultimately, about 50 people attended the event called Senior Salute, including 4 graduating Epsilon Chi members. Now that wasn't so hard, was it? Quote, graduation is something that you've always looked forward to since you set foot on college. That is a big accomplishment that a lot of people don't reach, Petitfrere said. The affinity graduations, some people live for that time. Some people are ready for that specific graduation rather than just commencement, because it's another thing to show and highlight you and what you represent. Black graduates at UK aren't the only ones who have seen their graduation celebrations abruptly canceled this year. First generation and LGBTQ students also saw their ceremonies called off as the university adjusted to a new state ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. First generation events celebrating the fact that you're the first person to graduate college in your family does sound like a pretty good idea. LGBT-based events, your sexual preferences and your identity, at least how you identify at this very moment, having a special event for that doesn't really make any sense because that has nothing to do with actually accomplishing something and setting an example for future people in your family to move forward and get educated and better yourself in life. I have no problem with people declaring they're LGBT or living their way that they want to live, but that's different from people being the first person to ever make it through school in their entire family. Some of these extra ceremonies, maybe they are legitimate, but they can all be acknowledged privately. And that's the problem when you have to do these diversity, equity, and inclusion bans. There's no way to say, okay, well, this could kind of be legitimate, just don't be hysterical about it. Let's support this, let's support that, let's give people a hand if they need some extra opportunity to move forward in their studying or need some additional resources and we have a budget for it. That's okay, as long as you don't discriminate against everyone else. But because of the absurd pushing of all of this in colleges and universities nationwide, as well as in businesses, You have to cut it all off, and some people that could have qualified for something legitimate then don't get that opportunity. They ruin it for everybody. A UK spokesperson said in a statement to Inside Higher Ed that the previous affinity celebrations were held outside of the university's official commencement ceremonies and were optional. Quote, "We will continue to comply with the law while celebrating all students and their distinctive achievements at our official commencement ceremonies," according to the spokesperson. And that's the whole point. Being a certain skin color or having a certain sexual preference or being indigenous is not really an accomplishment. It really isn't. Being the first in your entire family to ever go to college, that does feel like an accomplishment. They went on to say, quote, "Additionally, student groups are always welcome to host events and programming. We know how meaningful these celebrations have been to many. While the university can't continue sponsoring these events, we will continue working to ensure all students feel seen, valued, and supported." Other Kentucky universities also canceled affinity graduations, events intended to celebrate the accomplishments of minority students, along with cuts to cultural centers and DEI offices. But again, just kind of being a minority or having a certain sexual preference is not really an accomplishment. Universities in Utah also made similar moves after state lawmakers banned DEI. Beyond the state policies, President Donald Trump's anti-DEI efforts have also contributed to the cancellation of ceremonies, including at Harvard University and Maricopa Community Colleges in Arizona, which ended their Native American commencements. In February, the Trump administration's anti-DEI Dear Colleague letter claimed some affinity ceremonies were a shameful echo of a darker period in the country's history. Because you are excluding certain students and you're celebrating other students when they're all supposed to be coming together to go forward in life and hopefully be successful and leaders in the country in the future. Graduation is a time for celebration, but also a time for participation where it's you and everyone else who made it through the last 4 years. It is an accomplishment, and it's something to be celebrated based on the graduation class, not based on your skin color or what you like to do sexually. A federal judge has since said the guidance in that letter cannot be enforced. Despite that, various institutions around the country have responded by closing DEI offices and ending programming like affinity graduations, even in states without anti-DEI legislation. Because it's one thing for a federal judge to say, "Oh, you can't enforce all these regulations." And then Trump says, "Hold my beer." And look at what he's done to Harvard University and Columbia University. There's all kinds of things they could do with the Department of Education to get these colleges to capitulate and follow along with the program. Affinity graduations, many of them decades-long traditions at their institutions, aim to celebrate the achievements of students who have been historically unwelcome in higher education. They also tend to feature culturally appropriate music, food, and dancing, allowing students to celebrate in an environment that is familiar and comfortable. It's a good idea to acknowledge achievements of students who've been historically unwelcome in higher education. I will say they are leaving out the Jews, because the Jews were not welcome at colleges and universities. I recently found out that my grandfather actually had to change his last name to be welcome to go to a college, just based on being Jewish. And while Harvard has multiple categories for 2024 of paid-for, sponsored affinity celebrations, and supposedly this is for people that were historically marginalized against going to colleges, they left out the Jews. Funny, you'd never expect that coming from Harvard. Or maybe you would. Quote, "When students from historically disadvantaged backgrounds graduate, many want to celebrate the joy they feel after having done what it takes to get through college," according to Crystal Garcia, Assistant Professor of Education Administration at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. But affinity graduations are meant to recognize and celebrate the accomplishments of particular communities that have overcome barriers to graduate from college. These barriers may include racial discrimination or anti-LGBT rhetoric and legislation. But the celebrations have faced right-wing backlash. Conservatives and normal people argue that the events are exclusionary towards straight and white students and are predicated on what they see as the harmful idea that minority graduates couldn't adequately celebrate their accomplishments in the presence of those students. We're just going to have these affinity graduations that exclude just straight white students, and everyone else gets special extra graduations. Nothing wrong with that. Also paid for by the colleges and universities that are federally funded. University leaders like to routinely counter that. While affinity graduations focus on celebrating specific groups and cultures, they're open to all. You're just not allowed on stage. On several of the campuses that have faced cancellations this year, students and community organizations have stepped in to hold alternative events. Which, if it's important, of course you ought to do it on your own. It's just like throwing a party. What's the big deal? A church in Louisville, Kentucky hosted a citywide celebration for black graduates of all the city's colleges, including the University of Louisville and Bellarmine University, both of which canceled black planned graduations, according to WHAS, a local ABC station. The student newspaper at Morehead State University, also in Kentucky, said that students held an off-campus lavender graduation for LGBT students after MSU's was canceled. J.C. Thornton, executive director of Project Rainbow Utah, so you know what she's all about, graduated this year with a master's in social work from Webster State and was determined to participate in a lavender graduation to celebrate the occasion because she loves purple. She worked with the social work student organization to reserve a classroom to house the gathering, which wasn't publicized online, in hopes of avoiding protests or being shut down by the university. She did it on the down low. The room was also booked as a regular club meeting rather than a special event. I don't think there's any problem with having private celebrations for any purpose. It doesn't have to be for graduation. Could be because it's Sunday. Could be because you won the lottery. Could be because your friend is getting married. Whatever. Just don't expect the government to subsidize events that are race-based or LGBT-based or because you're indigenous or Latinx, which no one really wants to be. That's not for the government to pay for or for colleges to officially sponsor. Her small event opened with pizza and live music, after which attendees listened to a speech about the origins of lavender graduation, which apparently is a thing. Then participants joined in a circle, I feel like I'm there, with these vivid descriptions, where they were invited to, quote, share appreciations and struggles about going to college and resolutions of what we can do going forward as members of the community. All of this according to Thornton. It was a special moment for Thornton, who said that attending a lavender graduation can be especially important to LGBT graduates who might not have the support of their families during big celebrations like commencement. Quote, when these moments of celebration come around, often we feel that grief. And lavender graduation affords that opportunity for us to be with family and to make new connections who become lifelong family. Okay, it's a party. Good for you. Webster State did not immediately respond to Inside Higher Ed's request for comment. In an article for KSL, a local TV news station, a university spokesperson said that because of the new state DEI ban, quote, we can't engage in prohibited discriminatory practices, which includes promoting differential treatment of individuals based on a personal identity characteristic, but that student clubs had more leeway to take on these traditions. You would think if you had an LGBT student club or an indigenous people's Latinx club or whatever, or a nightclub, whatever the student club would be, they could organize these kinds of things. Why not? Just don't expect the government to pay for it. Student organizations have been continuing events previously hosted by the universities since DEI bans first emerged several years ago. But students have argued that it can be a huge burden to balance these events with their classes and jobs. And without the stability that comes with the same staff members and offices organizing events year after year, some worry that these events will die out as leadership turns over. It actually requires effort to do things that are important. And that's what these students are starting to try to figure out. Do you want to go to the trouble of having one of these events? If it's actually important, then sure, do it. If not, don't expect the colleges and the federal government to pay for these kinds of things. Thornton and Petitfier both believe their newly created traditions will live on, though. As the head of an LGBT nonprofit, Thornton hopes to continue supporting lavender graduations in Utah operationally and financially for years to come through Project Rainbow Utah. Petitfier, meanwhile, said he's already spoken with the younger members of Epsilon Chi about hosting next year's senior salute. Quote, we're doing the work that our fraternity prides itself on. We're just doing what we signed up for. So every time people be like, y'all are doing something big, he said, we're just doing what we think needs to be done. Imagine doing what needs to be done. That's what you're supposed to be doing. What do you want, a cookie? And from the Harvard Crimson, Harvard will not fund affinity group graduation celebrations following Education Department warning. It does make me wonder, what was it about the warning from the Department of Education saying, cut it out with the affinity graduations and all the discrimination on campus, that they said, you know what? It's really our affinity graduations we need to stop. We're going to try to do all the other discrimination and see if we can get away with it. But when it comes to these affinity graduations, that we have to cut out. I don't know. Maybe it'll come out in a lawsuit. Harvard will no longer host or fund affinity group celebrations during commencement, the university's former diversity office wrote in an email to affinity groups. The decision comes months after the U.S. Department of Education threatened another wave of funding cuts if the university did not cancel graduation celebrations that might separate students based on race. Well, of course it's going to separate students based on race. That's the whole point of the affinity graduations, and they admit to that. Though the email was sent from an email address belonging to Harvard's Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the office was renamed Community and Campus Life hours before, according to an email from Sherry Charleston, the university's Chief Community and Campus Life Officer, formerly Harvard's Chief Diversity Officer. So if you just change their title to Chief Campus Life Officer, somehow that's going to help you in your battle with the federal government. I don't think that's going to do it. Since the Education Department's threat, which was more like a promise than a threat, amid several other ensuing battles with the Trump administration over diversity programming and funding, Harvard officials had left affinity groups in the dark for weeks about commencement planning for affinity events before the word came down. Last year, Harvard absurdly hosted 10 affinity celebrations for the class of 2024. University spokesperson Jason Newton wrote in an email statement that Harvard is reviewing the facts that were issued on February 28th by the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Quote, Harvard remains committed to building a community where individuals who bring a broad array of backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives come together to learn, grow, and thrive, and equally committed to complying with the law, he wrote. I don't know why colleges decided that if they cancel their affinity graduation celebrations that somehow that would help them with the government. It's not nearly enough, and they're about to find out.